Okay, let's get started. The last time I saw you, which was over a week ago, we were talking about Thomas Hobbes and his great work, The Leviathan. We introduced The Leviathan. We talked a little bit about where it came from, and we explored some of the foundational ideas in the beginning of the text. So what we're going to do today is to continue with that discussion, and then when we come back next time, we'll finish up our consideration of Hobbes by looking at the kind of government that he imagines, and we will ask what might be the role for, say, a Hobbesian style of politics looking forward. But before we get there, let's remind ourselves a little bit, as we always do, what we covered last time. Let's remind ourselves the path we've traveled. In our introduction to Hobbes, we observed that the book itself was written during the tumult of the 17th century, which was characterized by religious conflict, or we might say between the convergence of religious difference and geopolitical difference. And so the composition of the work takes place in a larger European environment of the 30 Years' War, in which we see different states coming into conflict with each other based on supposedly religious differences. And then more immediately we saw it being composed in the context of the English Civil War, during which Charles I, the King of England, had been imprisoned and beheaded. And so it's in this context of a sort of political upheaval that we see Hobbes penning this work. And I made the argument to you last time that what's interesting about it is that he, in the context of this redrawing of the political lines, that he was therefore very interested in trying to come up with new ways of formulating the question of how do we define sovereignty? And I made the suggestion to you that the problem with sovereignty in the 17th century, as it was expressed through the model of divine kingship, was that if people cannot agree on what it means to be divine, if there are different views on what is the true faith, trying to then elaborate a model of authority that rests or is premised upon that faith will be inadequate. And that's what we see then in the context of the English Civil War. The challenge for Hobbes was to try to draw up a new framework for asserting sovereignty, one that did not have as its base or at its root some kind of transcendental claim to power. And what do I mean by that? Something that is beyond the material, so something that is outside of this world. In the context of divine kingship, the idea of divine kingship is that it makes transcendentalist claims to authority, namely that the king serves by virtue of divine authority, so that the king represents God on earth. That's a transcendental claim to power. The problem with a transcendental claim is if people start to disagree on their sort of transcendental views, then you'll find that the basis for your authority is disrupted, and that's what we find indeed in the 17th century. So the Hobbesian vision is to replace a transcendental view of authority with an authority that I suggested last time was materialized, that was grounded in the most basic thing you could imagine, namely the individual who makes up the state. So rather than being a model of sovereignty top-down in which divine will creates kingship which then rules over subjects that they may incur divine favor, Hobbes instead flips that around, and he then constructs a model of sovereignty which is starting from the individual. And we noted last time that there's a kind of core curiosity in Hobbes, which is on the one hand he has this radical idea of freedom and equality, in which he asserts at the very center of his project of reformulating sovereignty the radical freedom and equality of the individual. And indeed, it is the sovereignty that comes out of that freedom and equality that is the premise of the Leviathan. But then on the other hand, the model of political authority that he constructs from that is very absolutist, and he imagines a state in which powers are concentrated overwhelmingly in the hands of what he calls an artificial life or an artificial man. He reformulates essentially what looks a lot like kingship, is simply that the basis for that kingship has been radically redefined. And we explored the first parts, several of the chapters of the first part of the book, which is not common to review, but I wanted to go through it because I think it's very interesting in terms of the larger project or the larger context in which Hobbes is writing. We looked at that question in chapters 10 through 13, the question of power, the question of manners or of civilization, and the question of religion. And the reason that he engages in those topics is he wants to tear down what is conventionally understood to be the basis of power and authority in our society. in order for him to draw up this radical vision of freedom and equality that he then proceeds to elaborate, the first thing he needs to do is to eliminate our thinking that prevents us, impedes us from understanding the true nature of ourselves. And that is all this accumulated conventional idea, conventional wisdom that's grown up around this question of who should rule, who has power, and so on. And so we looked at that question last time. We looked at the nature of these concepts. And you may recall that I made the point that if you look at the sequence of the chapters, it's very interesting because he has the question of power, the question of civilization, the question of religious truth, and then he has man in a state of nature, which follows from all those. And so instead of looking at those questions of power, of manners, and of religion in a sort of positive sense, actually it's an effort of deconstruction. Let's deconstruct our false notions of what power is, deconstruct our sense of what civilization is. And once we've deconstructed all that, what are we left with? We're left with the possibility then to imagine what man looks like in a state of nature. So we can strip away the artifice that we've created around ourselves through human society, and once we've done that, then we have the opportunity to see man, as it were, in all of his nakedness. And that's what we then finished up with when we looked at the question of man in the state of nature, chapter 13, of the natural condition of mankind as concerning their felicity and misery. We had to rush through this chapter, so we'll come back to this chapter, and then we'll go from there and look at the three natural laws that he lays out, and look at the challenge that he wants to set out for us in terms of the model of sovereignty that he constructs. And if we do it right, we'll get to the end of class today, looking at then the way in which Hobbes makes claims for the existence of the social contract inside all political civil societies. So let's remind ourselves, what is the state of nature? What does he argue in this chapter on the state of nature? It is, as I mentioned last time, we might think of it as we might examine this chapter as a kind of radical thought experiment. What do we mean by a thought experiment? Meaning, let's construct a vision in our heads and see what it leads to. And the thought experiment that Hobbes engages in is to ask what happens if we strip away all of civil power, civil authority around us, and we simply imagine who we are without any of the accoutrements of political society, political life. What happens? Who are we in this context? And he has then a set of premises which are operative in that context, which explain what we look like in a state of nature. And the most important of these is this radical idea of equality, that we are all of us equal one to another. Now, that doesn't mean that every person is exactly the same. Some people are smarter, some are faster, some are stronger. So he's not making some claim for everybody should be exactly the same in that sense. What he means by this idea of radical equality is that there is no one individual who by dint or by virtue of their own skills can somehow rise above anybody else to a position of meaningful authority. So that the sense of equality is actually a question of power. That in the state of nature, there is no means whereby one person can accumulate power over any other person in any meaningful or lasting or enduring way, because fundamentally we are all basically the same. No one person has any greater right than any other person to command or to rule. So this notion then that in the state of nature we are all fundamentally equal means that therefore we are locked into a competition all with one another, because from our equality comes, as he says, the equality of hope of attaining our ends. From this equality of ability ariseth equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And in the way to their end, which is principally their own conservation, and sometimes their delectation only, endeavor to destroy or to subdue one another. As I noted last time, Hobbes can be a little bit difficult to read for the non-native speaker as well as for the native speaker. But if you learn to read him well, he's very funny in this way. What is he saying here? From this equality of ability riseth equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. And what is our end? He says it is principally their own conservation, simply to keep ourselves alive, right? That is what people are primarily struggling for, although he says occasionally their delectation, meaning pleasures. And so as a result of this equality of hope, in order that we each may survive, we end up in this state of conflict with others who are coveting or who are interested in the same resources that we are interested in. and we end up, therefore, in this state of conflict. It says we, therefore, endeavor to destroy or to subdue one another. This means that the fundamental relationship that binds people together, or that defines how people interact in a state of nature, is not one of trust or confidence, but instead what he calls diffidence. Diffidence today means something different than it did back in the 17th century. Diffidence, in Hobbes's use of the word, means we would call it mistrust, a lack of trust in other people. Why is it then that the fundamental relationship, or that the fundamental characteristic defining the relationship between people in a state of nature is one of distrust? The answer is because if you are in an environment where everybody is going after the same thing, where everyone is seeking, in a context of radical equality, to attain their own ends, and you know that whatever it is that you want, somebody else wants it too. When you therefore meet someone, what are you thinking? Not that they are your friend, but rather that they are your enemy. And therefore, you must, as a matter of your own self-preservation, treat all people essentially through this lens of conflict and hostility. Everyone you meet, you must treat as an enemy. Because if you don't treat them as an enemy, they're very likely to treat you as an enemy, and that doesn't get you any further. That costs you your ability to preserve your own life. And so, as a result of this radical equality that exists in the state of nature, in this thought experiment, what we see Hobbes working out is this idea that between all people, absent some kind of larger structure, what exists naturally is a state of perpetual distrust, perpetual suspicion. And there's no way around that, because going back to this idea of equality, no one person can make greater claims for themselves than any other, and so therefore we're locked into this state. As he then says, from this condition of mistrust, of diffidence, what comes from this is what he calls war. So that in the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel, competition, mistrust, and glory. The first maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation. The first use violence, etc. And therefore, as a result of all this, what we find is that out of civil states, meaning when we're living in a state of nature, we're not living in a civil society, the environment that we end up inhabiting is one of perpetual war. He says there is always war of everyone against everyone else. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. So this is the notion of what he calls the war of all against all, that the fundamental characteristic of people in a state of nature is competition, diffidence, and a struggle for glory, and this means that we are constantly fighting with one another. He says, there is always war of everyone against everyone, for war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war. As it is in the nature of weather, for as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. In other words, it doesn't have to be raining for it to be a rainy day. You don't actually have to be fighting somebody in order to be locked into a state of perpetual conflict. It is the threat of conflict that then creates this condition. So given then this sort of natural state that we're in, this creates a fundamental problem, because this is not to our own self-interest to be locked into a state of perpetual competition and conflict with everybody else. Note, by the way, the difference in terms of the natural self as Hobbes constructs it, in contrast with what Aristotle says. We saw that in Aristotle, that man in a state of nature, he stresses that we are fundamentally political, and that we seek to create political rules using our logos. Moreover, we also see in Aristotle that he doesn't believe that all people are radically equal, does he? Aristotle believes that there are some people better than others, hence his argument in favor of slavery as a natural condition. Some people deserve to be slaves. Why? What's the defining characteristic of the slave? Do we remember? They don't have their own logos, right? They can only understand the logos of others. Hobbes rejects this Aristotelian vision of nature. There's no difference between one person and another. There's no question of natural slavery. There's not some idea that the world is being constructed such that some group of people have logos and others don't. No, we're all the same. We're all the same. And therefore, there's no question that some people should have sort of natural claims to power or to authority. There's no question then that somehow politics will emerge naturally in our engagement with each other. All that emerges is the raw expression of brutal self-interest when people come together struggling over scarce resources, namely the war of all against all. The problem for Hobbes in this context is that when you're living in a state of perpetual anxiety, that the various things that we otherwise would try to do to make our lives better, to improve ourselves, to be civilized, become impossible. And as he says, and I read it last time, but I'll read it again because it's such a nice paragraph. He says, "Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth. No navigation nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." That does not sound like a very nice place to live. There's no point in doing anything because someone's going to come and take it away from you. And so all your days are spent, one of these like nature documentaries, simply waiting for something to come and kill you. And so all you're doing is trying to kill other people until it happens to you. So if you imagine, we imagine the Aristotelian idea that when two people come together, what they do is they work out political rules. We saw that in that discussion in Aristotle at the beginning of Book 1, the idea that a household creates modes of political authority, constitutional, regal, and the like. That therefore, from an Aristotelian perspective, the act of interacting or the act of coming together with somebody else creates politics simply as a function of that encounter, of that exchange. For Hobbes, this is not possible. Politics does not emerge spontaneously. Whatever instinct we might have to create politics will be subsumed by this condition of the war of all against all. I don't have time to engage with you in politics if I'm busy stabbing you and taking your stuff. So therefore, politics cannot emerge naturally as a function of how we interact. It must therefore be constructed. It has to come from someplace else. And this goes back then to what we observed at the beginning of our discussion last time, which is that he argues at the beginning of the book that the process of constructing meaningful sovereign rule is one of moving us out of nature into something that we can construct, what he calls an artificial animal, an artificial life. That politics, therefore, needs to be something that we can come together to work out in an artificial way. It's not something that's going to emerge naturally. And so the problem we have is in this context where we are locked into a perpetual struggle, how do we create some kind of political solution? We can all recognize that living under these conditions is suboptimal, to say the least. That rational people would not seek to live a life where there is no letters, no society, no account of time. Look, not even commodious building. I trust you'll use that in a sentence at some point soon. So therefore, we recognize as reasonable beings that there has to be something better than this. The question is, how do we get there? This helps explain why we've gone through this exercise to deconstruct existing ideas of power, of civilization, and of religion. Because what Hobbes wants to tell us is, those are not substantive bases upon which to create political solutions. Look at what happened in the English Civil War. What was the value of divine kingship if a bunch of people could come, overthrow the king, chop off his head, and replace his government? That's not a stable basis for authority. Instead, we need to come up with a different model of authority. Just as conventional, just as constructed, but more meaningful in the sense that it can attach itself to some kind of mechanism of universal recognition and universal consent. He says at the end of this chapter, notably, that we might be tempted to think that politics might emerge from our sense of what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is unjust. We recall that in Plato we have an entire book dedicated to this notion of justice as an immanent quality of the soul, and the state therefore reflecting the justice of the individual, and so on. Hobbes is not impressed by that argument, as he says, in a state of war, there is no such thing as just or unjust. There's nothing you can say is right or wrong. All you have is in this context of radical freedom and radical equality, you have the right to do whatever you need to do in order to preserve your own life. There is therefore no question of something being just or unjust, because anything that's done to preserve your own life is inherently right. To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. Justice and injustice are none of the faculties, neither of the body nor mind. There is no natural sense of just and unjust. That also has to be constructed out of the same apparatus that we'll use to create some kind of a civil society. We cannot rely on some sort of transcendental or immanent qualities in the self to then elaborate some kind of superior political option. They have to be constructed. Therefore, we cannot make reference to them before we've actually built up the construct necessary in order for those to exist.